Welcome to the Cambridge Tech Podcast, talking all things technology from the heart of the UK's tech capital. Here are your hosts, Faye Holland and James Parton.
Hi, I'm James and welcome to the show. Faye is back next week, but then I'm away, so things will be back to normal in a couple of weeks. It's just that time of year, isn't it? So a pretty standard week for me this week. Lots of meetings and planning and a great recording session with Andrew Williamson of Cambridge Innovation Capital. Keep an eye out for that one. It's a cracker. Okay, on to this week's tech news. Battery firm Ekion Technologies, who emerged from the University of Cambridge's Department of Engineering to commercialise a new class of lithium-ion battery, have been on the business development trail in the Far East, holding more than 200 meetings across the three markets with potential partners and customers. In Korea, 7 of the top 12 battery makers requested material samples for testing, and in China, 14 of the top 40 players expressed similar interest. All sounds very positive. Sorry, I think there's a battery joke in there somewhere. Apologies. Last week's guests, Anthrotech, have closed a 950k seed round with a 12 million valuation, so great news for them. With the new money, they plan to leverage and deepen strategic relationships with global healthcare providers, robotics pioneers, and major entertainment studios. Several key announcements and partnerships are anticipated in the coming months. We'll keep tuned for that, and I'd really strongly recommend you listen back to last week's episode with co-founders Nasmus and Rahul. We're both big fans of their work. Semiconductor and deep tech companies in Cambridge and the east of England have been urged to engage with a significant initiative in the sector between the UK and Canada. TechWorks, the UK Industry Association for Semiconductors and Deep Tech Innovation, has signed a landmark MOU with the Canadian Semiconductor Council to foster strategic collaboration between the two countries' semiconductor ecosystems. The agreement recognises the highly complementary strengths of both nations in areas such as advanced packaging, compound semiconductors, quantum, AI, neuromorphic processors, sustainable materials, and more. The UK Science Minister, Lord Vallance, added this partnership reflects the UK and Canada's shared commitment to strengthening semiconductor supply chains and deepening international cooperation in critical technologies. It will help create new opportunities for business and researchers and support our plan for change through long-term economic growth. Okay, on to this week's interview. I caught up with David Cleevely to mark the launch of his new book, Serendipity, It Doesn't Happen by Accident. So welcome back onto the show, David. You remain our only ever two-part episode guest, so you still hold that title. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, we had such a deep and wide-ranging conversation with you in November that we felt it was only right that we pulled together the serendipity-related highlights from that conversation to celebrate your book launch. So following this quick catch-up, listeners will be able to hear those highlights to close out this episode. But I, of course, would strongly recommend that you listen back to the full conversations, which you can find in episodes 112 and 113, which were recorded back in November 2024. So, David, like I say, welcome back on. Why don't we start with the why? What was the inspiration behind writing the book?
I suppose the inspiration was curiosity. I'd noticed that serendipitous events happened, and I was wondering why they happened. And in particular, I'd been involved in Cambridge Network and setting up the Centre for Science and Policy and lots of other networking organisations in Cambridge, because I had this intuitive feeling that this generated interesting opportunities for people, and I'd experienced that myself. And what I wanted to do was get that all down into a coherent form to see whether it was possible to actually engineer, to design serendipity into a system.
So have you designed specific frameworks around serendipity? Is that the key learning that people will have from picking the book up?
I think the key learning is that you need to change the way you think about serendipity. When Horace Walpole coined the term, he thought about it as happy coincidence. And the title of the book says serendipity doesn't happen by accident, and it makes people smile because they think serendipity happens by accident. I want to change that. It's not what happens. What actually happens is that there are systems, there are networks, there are arrangements within organizations which so utterly change the chance of something good happening that it's not by accident, it's much more by design. And some of the book talks about the principles that we could use to make that more likely. But really the objective of the book is to change the way people think about this.
And who did you have in mind when you wrote the book? Who's your kind of target audience for the book?
Well, my target audience, I suppose, is born out of frustration with large organisations and government departments. I think that there's a notion, as a civil servant once said to me, if you talk about serendipity around here, you'll be thought you don't know what you're talking about. And that's a very big issue. I'm aiming it at people who are frustrated by innovation not happening quickly enough, by new ideas not being adopted, by spending loads of money on research and development or big programs and not getting the results that they want. And the key here is, with all the best will in the world, planning for, as I say in one of the chapters, predictable outcomes is not what you want to do. You want to actually design things so the unpredictable is going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did the writing process go for you? How long did it take? What's your method? Pull back the curtain for us.
Well, the method was a bit like my issue with taking exercise. I had to get a personal trainer. And in this particular case, it was a chap called Ian Phillipson who I collaborated with. He basically sat with me and we talked through what was going on in the book. And he jotted some things down and I jotted some things down, and we basically batted these things together until there was enough material. And then about last August, July, August, I started writing really seriously, writing some serious slabs of text. When we did the podcast in November, I was fully optimistic that I would get it finished by January, but here we are in June, and it's finally finished.
Well, pleased to hear that. Can you share any kind of favourite insight or anecdote from the book?
The book begins with my wife and I arriving at the Talisker distillery on Skye. And in those days, this is getting on for 50 years ago, the Talisker distillery wasn't the Disneyland that you see now. It was actually closed. And we stood there, having driven there in our old Hillman Husky. And then down out of the unmade road from the Coolin Mountains came our next-door neighbours from Cambridge. And that's the kind of thing that makes you think. I mean, obviously over dinner parties, it makes somebody, as you just did, laugh. It's just a coincidence. It's just one of those things that happened by chance. And then as you go through the book, you'll see that time after time after time, these things are happening, and they're happening at a rate that can't be explained simply if things are completely random. There's a network in which we exist, our relationships with other people, and circumstances that make those kinds of things extremely likely. It doesn't happen by accident.
Well, I think you've done a fabulous job of whetting the appetite for the book. So I guess the most important question is, where can people go and find it?
You can find it on Amazon, and that's fairly straightforward, provided you spell my name correctly and check that Amazon doesn't change the spelling of Cleevely, Cleevely. You can also go to conductingserendipity.com, which is the website where you'll find also various other resources, including blogs that I'm publishing and some of the appendices that you find in the book. Or is it appendixes? No, it's appendices. A copy editor would have picked that one up. Appendices which describe some of the terms and the model for looking at serendipity and various other useful resources.
Okay, well, excellent. Well, like I say, appreciate your time and checking back in with us, and we wish you all the success in the world for the book.
Well, in a world of serendipity, something good will happen.
If you are a startup looking to grow in Cambridge, The Bradfield Centre offers a range of flexible membership packages which put you in control of your office and home working mix. There's a vibrant, collaborative atmosphere, on-site cafe, plenty of green outside space, and regular member social events. We also offer a range of high-quality meeting spaces for hire, and for tech event organisers, our auditorium, lakeside pavilion, and atrium spaces are perfect to bring your communities together for in-person and hybrid events. For more information, visit bradfieldcentre.com or call 01223 919 600.
It was one of those odd serendipitous moments. I was walking down the school corridor in a break, and the careers master was short of some people to go and listen to somebody from Post Office Telecommunications explain how you could apply and be sponsored at university. And I went in. I thought it was quite interesting. I thought that the idea of telecommunications was rather intriguing. So I applied along with several hundred others, and 18 of us got selected to be paid for to go to university. But it was rather more than that, and that's rather important because we spent a year before university, so we had to take a year off, as it were, year out. And there I learned about special and general relativity, Maxwell's equations, a whole load of other theoretical stuff. I built an analog computer. I learned how to operate a lathe. I built a steam engine. I learned how to climb a telegraph pole, how to join wires up. And I even learned how to use a piece of copper wire as a divining rod. And I was able to find an 11 kVA cable by the fact that this divining rod twitched in my hands before we put the drill down so that we could put in the pole. So I learned a whole load of stuff about how exchanges work, how transmission works, the practical problems on the ground of putting all this in, and I learned some very sophisticated bits of physics and mathematics and electronics. And so when I arrived at university, I must admit the first year I didn't really have to do a huge amount because I'd already covered vast amounts of the stuff. So one Sunday morning, I opened the Sunday Times colour supplement and there was an article about the Cambridge phenomenon. And I thought to myself, right, that's it. I am going to set myself up as a consultancy and I'm going to do it in Cambridge, and it has to be on the Science Park because that's where everything is happening. In actual fact, my first offices were shared with a company called OWL, and we set up in Unit 128, which is, again, no more than about 100 metres away from here. I'd been doing quite a lot of work with the European Commission on some of their big projects, their big programmes, and I continued some of that work as I set up my own consultancy business. Looking back on it, absolutely horrific. I think one does these things being incredibly naive. I would never advise anybody to do what I did. The risks I took. Of course, entrepreneurs don't think of themselves as taking risks. They think that they're in control of the destiny and everything is going to go fine. But there was one year when I didn't pay myself a penny. I certainly came very close to bankruptcy. If things hadn't turned around, if I hadn't worked hard, if I hadn't had a couple of lucky breaks, I wouldn't be sitting here. During the middle of the 1990s, I began to see the internet and the web in particular as a very major issue of change. And I wanted the company to develop some web-based products. Tried second-hand cars and selling houses. One of the other components to this was that everything that Analysis was doing was underpinned by a small software team, 6 or 7 people, which I call business processes and services. In other words, everything the company was doing was mediated by the software that we were running. And we wrote it ourselves. There was none of this stuff that was available for you with Salesforce.com or anything else like that. Okay. Unusually, within Analysis, we had world-class web expertise at a time when nobody else had it. So when I bumped into Jonathan Milner at dinner, and he talked about the idea of buying a goat farm and raising antibodies, my initial reaction was, firstly, you don't want to have any overheads. But secondly, my conversation with him was directed at, if you've got these antibodies, how can you get them to the customer? And it turned out you could send them through the post, at which point I went, well, we've got a web business. And Jonathan's expertise in the biochemistry, which I had to learn, different ends of peptides, and, I can't even now recite all the names of all the amino acids, but it doesn't really matter. The important thing I brought to bear was that insight into business and the web. And that is what made Abcam. It's never one person having an idea. I mean, if you take Abcam, for example, it's Jonathan and me, right? The whole point of doing these things is to have conversations. I like to say, if you're investing in a company that's come and pitched to you, the best outcome is where they pitch to you, you have a conversation, you have your own ideas, and as a result of that discussion, something emerges that is better than either of you could have done on your own. So there is always that kind of synthesis. The other one is, out of all that list, not all of them have succeeded. I mean, one at least on that list was a spectacular failure. But that shouldn't necessarily put you off. One of the ways that I learned the most, I think, is through Cambridge Angels, which I founded with Robert Sansom. Honestly, they are the brightest, most interesting, sometimes the most troublesome, but, certainly the most insightful bunch of people about investment that I've ever come across. We are so lucky in Cambridge to have such an organisation helping startups. It's another great example of serendipity. Robert arrived having sold his company, bought the house opposite me in the road in which we live, introduced himself as a new neighbour, said, "Where's the Angel Group? Let's have lunch and have a chat about setting one up." So that's what we did. So that's how it was set up. And because I was running analysis at the time, that gave me a little bit of support to do things. And I'd already done things like Cambridge Network and a few other bits and pieces in Cambridge, so we knew quite a number of people. Robert knew quite a lot of people. So I think we kicked off with an initial dozen or so around the table in the first place. It's turned out to be a very significant force in Cambridge. There's another bit of, I suppose, serendipity. Raspberry Pi came to Cambridge Angels, and some unsung heroes put money in, people like Robert Sansom, and Jack Lang, of course, actually reasonably well known for his contribution to Raspberry Pi. As it got off the ground, they decided that they were going to need a proper board to run the company. That is the company that produces the pies. And so they asked Herman, Sherry Kutu, and myself to join. And as Sherry said to me, "When you get an invitation from Raspberry Pi like that, you're not going to refuse, are you?" So we all three of us joined the board. The charity was a separate organisation. The charity at that point owned 100% of the trading company. We sat on the trading company board, and I made my contributions. And then David Braben was asked by the charity trustees to take me out for a rather nice lunch at Japas, a Japanese restaurant, and asked me if I would like to become chair. Not only chair of the trading company, but also chair of the charity. And again, following Sherry's line, how could I refuse? When I took over, I don't know, a dozen people, maybe a little more in the entire organisation. And the charity didn't have a proper business model. It was one of those things where we're giving money away to good causes. We must be doing good things. Well, in my book, a charity has to be run just like a business. You have to understand exactly what you're doing, what you're trying to achieve, and you have to make every single penny count in order to be able to do that. So I did a number of things, reorganising what was going on. I was involved in all the technical strategy discussions about the development of the pies, as well as the strategy for how to develop the foundation. So serendipity means good fortune happens if you try. And it derives from the land of serendipits, happy chance, happy coincidence, Sri Lanka, Ceylon, as was in the old days. Serendipity is something that once you've noticed it happening, you realise that it's absolutely everywhere in your life and will be the thing that determines what path your career and social life and everything else takes. It's all chance. Because I'm an engineer at heart. How do I turn that knowledge into something that can actually deliver something useful? And it turns out that whilst I've experimented with things like Cambridge Wireless and Cambridge Network and Cambridge Angels and CSAP and all these other things, it really has occurred to me that when we look at the way in which we're generating ideas in society, in the economy, and then actually turning them into useful product, there's a step which is the step of how do you get the right people to talk to the right people so that something can happen. We do that in Cambridge extraordinarily well. A lot of the stuff where I've managed to do things in Cambridge have been through those chance encounters and those kinds of discussions, raising money or having new ideas or whatever else it is. So the question really here is, can you operationalize it? And there's an example of how that was turned into something practical in the late 18th century. And the Lunar Society was a society that was formed by people like Wedgwood and Bolton. And their idea was that they would come together at the full moon, because that's when you could travel on horseback during the evening, hence the Lunar Society, and you would discuss the latest scientific and other ideas, including art as well as science. I'm a great believer in this crossover. Just doing science or just doing engineering doesn't cut it. We live a holistic existence. You cannot do it solely by looking at one discipline. They took the same kind of approach. And as a result, I'll give you a couple of examples. One was there was somebody who you would now describe as being on the spectrum, a chap called James Watt, who was then introduced and managed to get enough resources so that he could build a thing called a steam engine, or rather, he took the Newcomen engine and he had an idea for how to make it much more efficient. And he had his governor, which allowed you to regulate how fast the steam engine would work. Watt would never have got that without the Lunar Society. And as part of that extended network, there was a chap called Stevenson, who as a young man approached one of the other members of the Lunar Society and said, I've got a great idea for how to put Watt's engine onto steel rails and actually make it move up and down and pull things. And that's how we got the steam engine. We forget that in order to drive proper innovation, we need to have these structures in place. And this serendipity, my book is called Serendipity. It doesn't happen by accident. And it doesn't happen by accident. Of course, there's chance involved. I'm not going to guarantee when I walk down the street or I'm cycling in Cambridge, I'm going to bump into somebody who's going to change the complete direction of my life. But I can change the probabilities of that happening. And the insight that I think I bring on this is that we can construct networks, as we've done with Cambridge Network, as we did with Cambridge Angels and all the other things that I've done. We could construct networks that raise the probability of those chance encounters. You quoted the Impulse program. These chance encounters lead to great things, right? It was indeed my strapline. It's basically you engineer the opportunity for these chance encounters and great things would happen. It's a missing part of the infrastructure of the UK. Going back to industrial strategy and where we get to, I think we need to put in place organisational structures similar to my Policy Fellows programme at Cambridge and Royal Academy of Engineering that will enable those interactions to take place. They will seemingly be random, but they will shift the probability. In the same way as I put two chemicals into a flask and they react very slowly. But if I put a catalyst in there, they will react really quickly because the catalyst gives you the surface by which the molecules can actually meet and do their thing.
Today's show was produced by Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and supported by our media partner, Business Weekly. The Cambridge Tech Podcast is available on all major podcast platforms and on cambridgetechpodcast.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give it a 5-star review. It'll really help others discover the show.